about what implicit bias is. And this is just kind of proof that implicit bias is a phrase that has sort of entered our common vernacular these days. This is really something that people outside of academia are really getting interested in. And so when Van Jones explains it, he explains it in a very sort of layperson way, but of course, a lot of us social scientists have a pretty good understanding of what implicit bias refers to. So we know that we're looking at automatic evaluations of target objects. These are often unconscious and uncontrollable because they are automatic associations. And because of this, a lot of people are sort of unwilling and unable to express their implicit bias. Now, again, for those people who are following the news and the non-academics, it may be really exciting news to hear that it's actually possible to change or shift these implicit attitudes. But again, of course, I am talking to people who are a little bit familiar with this, and this is kind of old news. So individuals who know anything about implicit bias or the malleability of implicit bias know that research in this area has kind of been going on for almost 2 decades now. So there's evidence of this malleability of implicit attitudes, and one of the early studies that looked into this was conducted in the early 2000s by Nosek, Baron, and Bonaji. And they had participants look at images of liked black athletes and disliked white politicians. And so they were able to show that when participants were focused on the race of the targets that they were looking at, they showed an implicit pro-white bias. But once they asked participants to shift their focus to the occupation, to a different identity of these targets, they were actually able to flip the implicit bias. So they showed more positive association with the black targets relative to the white targets. And so similarly, changing the context in which a target is seen can also shift these implicit attitudes. So for example, when we see a target standing in front of a jail cell dressed as a prisoner, participants, when looking at white versus black targets, showed an implicit pro-white bias. But when they saw the same targets, both black and white, standing in front of a jail cell dressed in a suit and therefore presented as a lawyer, participants again flipped their implicit association bias and showed more positive associations with black relative to white. Another thing that can sort of shift these implicit attitudes is affect. So we know that when people are angry, they are more likely to rely on their implicit stereotypes, and their bias will increase, their pro-white bias relative to pro-black bias. And additionally, when participants listen to happy relative to sad music, again, we can see a shift in implicit attitudes. And in this case, we find that when participants are manipulated into feeling sad, they actually show lower implicit pro-white bias. Now, this is an ostracism symposium, so hopefully this has sort of led you into thinking about ostracism. And we know that ostracism is one way to induce these feelings, these negative feelings, sadness, when an individual is ostracized. But what's interesting about this construct is that ostracism doesn't only make people feel sad. People who are ostracized also report feeling social pain, threatened sense of control over their environment, loss of feelings of belonging, lower self-esteem, and reduced feelings of meaning. And so, because ostracism has been shown to have an effect on so many different domains, it's not initially clear what effect this will have on implicit attitudes, if they can shift implicit racial attitudes, and in which direction. And so that leads me to my current research question. So I wanted to determine whether or not there is a relationship between implicit racial bias and ostracism. Now, as you just saw, the hypotheses about this relationship aren't necessarily straightforward. So there are different theoretical reasonings that we might expect implicit bias to either increase or decrease following an ostracism experience. So first, ostracism might increase a pro-white bias. And this is because participants may feel threatened by being ostracized. They may feel that they need to regain control over the situation. They may feel anger. And also with this threat to their self-esteem, it may actually cause them to want to feel associated with their in-group if they're white, or with a high-status, historically advantaged out-group. Now, on the other hand, it is also possible that ostracism will decrease implicit bias. And this might be because it induces sadness, as we saw. It may also sort of prime these affiliative goals and make people want to associate with others regardless of what the target is, because they have this threatened sense of belonging. So in the study that I'm going to be presenting, I really was just interested in the relationship, whether or not there is a relationship between ostracism and implicit attitudes. And then once we have this sort of basic information, then we can move forward and start to sort of break it down and figure out what that relationship might be or why. So in order to investigate this question, I recruited 117 non-Black undergrads from York University in Toronto, and they were randomly assigned to either be included or excluded. So to manipulate feelings of inclusion versus exclusion, we used cyberball, which is a very common ostracism paradigm. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, I'll show you an example in just a second. And our main dependent variable was the implicit association test. Now, we also asked participants a number of explicit attitude measures. So we gave them the feeling thermometer, where they were asked to rate their feelings of warmth toward various different racial groups. We got just general explicit racial attitudes from them based on these scales. And we also looked at their basic needs for belonging, self-esteem, meaningful existence, etc., which are also often associated with ostracism. And then finally, we administered some manipulation checks. So this is the basic cyberball manipulation. Participants sit down in front of a computer. They are told that they are playing against two other participants who are supposedly in other rooms. They're told that they are going to be playing catch with these two other participants, and that when the ball is thrown to them, they're supposed to click on whichever participant they want to throw it to. In the include condition, the participant receives the ball 1/3 of the time. In the exclude condition, obviously, they are only receiving the ball once or twice at the beginning of the game, and then not at all for the rest of it. For our IAT, we use the typical white-black IAT. And so this measure is obviously used to measure the speed with which people can categorize faces as well as words. And being faster to categorize stimuli with white and pleasant, which is the stereotype, and black with unpleasant, is indicative of a pro-white implicit bias. Oops. Okay, so just to orient you to the graph, the y-axis here are the IAT scores, so higher numbers on that axis indicate greater degrees of implicit pro-white bias. So regardless of condition, we do see that participants are showing this pro-white implicit bias. But what's really interesting here is that the participants in the exclude condition show significantly less pro-white bias compared to those in the include condition. And I'll also mention that with the other scales, I didn't put them up in any tables, but we did find what we would assume all of those in the exclude condition did feel lower sense of belonging, lower mood, self-esteem, etc. And in terms of their explicit racial attitudes, there was no difference across conditions. So it does seem that this ostracism paradigm decreases implicit bias, at least in this particular study. But the important question here, which this data don't speak to, obviously, is why. So it doesn't really give us the mechanism. So perhaps this sort of gives us an idea that it was the feelings of sadness and the desire to affiliate that is promoting this change in implicit bias. But then another question is, why would these needs necessarily take precedent over the other needs, which we also know are being threatened in the ostracism manipulation? So obviously there's still a lot of work that I need to do in terms of this line of research. Next thing we want to do is we just want to replicate it and extend it. We want to make sure that this is a reliable effect. And eventually we would like to introduce group membership into this. So does it matter who the other participants are that are excluding you? If they are members of your in-group or your out-group, does that then change the way that you implicitly associate them in a following measure? And obviously, cyberball is a very popular, common ostracism paradigm, but there are a lot of other paradigms out there, so we do also want to try running this study with some other measures as well. Okay, so that's all for this. Does anybody have any questions?